Thank you, Brandon. There's a lot to like about the lecture today. A number of issues that you brought about that one has to consider and evaluate and look at this different lens and this perspective you gave. And there is some point of disagreement that I would bring about. Let me say first that definitely there's no question about it, that Israel has been a colonial project. The first people who talked about it was Napoleon. And Napoleon was very much interested in having an outpost for the West to control the nationalists and the forces that were developing the region. Bannerman had really seen Israel as also an outpost that would prevent the onslaught or the projection of any vigor or dynamics from the Muslim world. The Russians, everyone have seen in Israel a way in which it would give them a bridge to control the region. The British wanted exclusive, unfettered access to India. And with the Suez Canal, they knew they had to go through Arab land. The presence of Israel that would stand to divert, to dissect, to prevent the Arab East from coming close to the Arab West was absolutely necessary in their view to prevent and to preclude the possibility that the Arabs or any nationalist group would come in, would prevent or would constitute an obstacle for this access. And then oil. And oil not only just purely as a commodity. It so happens that 75% of the world proven reserves are in the Arab region. And then in the Muslim hand, if you include also Iran into it. And oil is not just purely as a strategic commodity. It was also a fungible asset. One of the most important coveted aspects of oil is the fact that there is so much surpluses in the hands of the Arabs. And the United States have used this in a more effective way than anybody could imagine. At one time, you were all maybe surprised. How could the US that controls all that region and all these custodians that the United States has put in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait and others, that they would raise the price 3 or 4 times? This was purely an economic interest of the United States, and that's what I really like about what Stephen has really put, is the economic argument and how this is a major motivation. They wanted the price of oil, as I've said a million times here, to rise to a level that would clean all the euro dollars, the Japanese surpluses that they had accumulated when the United States was embroiled in Vietnam, and they were able to sell the US and everybody else what US used to sell itself, and accumulated $2 trillion that in the action of OPEC that raised the price by 4 times in January, between October and January 73, 74, they cleaned all these surpluses within 6 months. All these surpluses that existed in the hands of the Europeans and the Japanese were completely diverted to Saudi Arabia, and from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf went to the US. I kid you not, there were 6 literally Saudis employed in Washington, primarily to be directed by the Americans as how they would speed the transfer of that surplus from the hands of the Arabs into the hands of the Americans, literally emptying all the coffers that the Arabs have been able to extract from the Europeans and the Chinese. Europeans and the Chinese, and Japanese didn't have oil, all right? And then the price of oil goes up, they have no domestic resources. So the only way they really could get this oil is to pay for it. And what did they pay for it? They paid with all the surpluses they had accumulated during the Vietnam War and others. The other aspect which is really important is that Israel has militated, has been a major, I don't want to give a lecture here, but I just want to thank Stephen, but he has provoked me into thinking of these fantastic points that he has brought about. This is the idea that Israel has militated against all nationalist projects, whether the Nasserite version or the Ba'athist version, any challenge to the supremacy, to the control, to the exclusive monopoly of control of the West over Arab resources and economies were basically thwarted by Israel. Israel was 2 times attacking Egypt, 56 and 67. The Israelis, and this is all in the book, fantastic, attacked the project where Iraq was trying to garner or nurture a nuclear capacity. They took advantage of the fact that Iraq and Iran were fighting each other, went and destroyed the Ozark facilities where Iraq was trying to really find some counterbalance, trying to see to what extent it might really be able to immune itself from any attacks and the imposition of the will of the empire over it. The only thing that I'm, a little bit concerned about, and this is an argument I really like, but I really feel that one also needs to raise a question. I really like the idea that you don't want to blame the Jews as Jews for these things, because this is not the Jews as much as the Zionists. And there are Christian Zionists that really come into the picture, probably more important than some of the Zionists that come from the Jewish quarter. But to completely dismiss the relationship between the capacity of AIPAC and others from influencing political policy. At one time, I was debating Buchanan, who by any standards is absolutely a fascist, or let's say right-winger, call him any name you want. I was talking all the time about Israeli-occupied territories. Hey, wait a minute, Congress is an Israeli-occupied territory. He, to some extent, was literally insinuating the Jews control the policy. I really subscribe to the proposition that it is the Zionists, it is really those right-wingers, it's all those who really are an affront to the universality of a religion like Judaism and to equate it with the political decadence of Zionism. And I think that, Stephen does a good job of trying to make that distinction, but not in any way, shape or form to underestimate the importance of these Zionist groups and their capacity to raise money and to influence. You see, the political system in the United States is a market system. It goes with the highest bidder. And as long as you keep this system open to this kind of economic influence, you literally give a chance to any force or power or group that has resources to commandeer and to bring, its influence on things. The politics of the United States are literally dictated by market forces than by any other forces that you might think. Thank you, Stephen, for such an incisive lecture and for making the distinctions you made and for bringing the clarity about distinctions that one necessarily must make, and to see Israel not as itself controlling the Americans as much as it is literally an instrument of subjugation that the United States has been so willingly and so competently able to exercise it. And yes, Israel is not the only one. Saudi Arabia is now on equal footing with the Israelis. The Arab conservative and religious archaic regimes are complicit in this equally to what the Israelis is doing. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaborsi. You highlighted many of the major themes and arguments and discussions within the book, and both you and Stephen have been referencing the struggle against Arab nationalism quite a lot. And there's so many examples, as I said, of how the United States and Israel have cleverly cooperated to find the cracks between forces within the Arab world that are caused by religion, nationality, ethnicity, place of birth, and really undermine so many of these movements in which Arabs in large part could take control of their own resources and their own governments in a much larger way than has been possible up to this point. So I imagine there must be questions about all these aspects of the book. Before we do that, we do have Doug, because there is a fundraising pitch. We had to bring Stephen over here and get some things set up here, and so to keep this thing going, Doug can tell us how we can help out.
Well, hello friends. So we, all our events are free because we do not want to have a financial barrier, to prevent anyone from listening to speakers like Stephen, or, and all the other great speakers, Eva Bartlett, that we've been bringing in. However, we still, and we're a very modest organization. We do operate on a shoestring, but nonetheless, we do have some financial expenses that we do have to meet, to maintaining the website, printing, promoting, and so on. So I'm going to just pass the hat. And if you can put a little bit in, it'll add up. We've got a good crowd, and hope to more than cover our expenses tonight, and maybe leave a bit for the future, because we've got some other great speakers on the horizon that we plan to bring in here.
Thanks, Doug. Looks like we have a question and answer period, and that can go to a certain point past 9 p.m., I think. We do have rules of order for all of these. I'd emphasize, first of all, of course, I guess it'll be me picking. I'll pick by hand whoever raises hand. We'll go around the room, different people, that sort of thing. I'm going to ask people to limit their remarks to 2 minutes maximum. You can make a comment instead of a question, but please keep it within 2 minutes. We have to give you a warning, time warning. We can't have back and forth between the speaker and the question person, because other people have to ask questions, and we've got to get to them. We'd ask to have respectful discussion only. We don't want to have derogatory, racist, or sexist, or homophobic, or any other kind of phobic comments tolerated. Otherwise, though, Stephen's available to answer questions on all these broad topics. So I'll just start picking people. Sure, Jerry. Yeah, maybe I should.
One simple question. You said that the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States overlap. Are there any areas where they conflict?
I would say that they don't have identical interests, obviously. I mean, the U.S. interests are different in some respects from Israeli interests, and Israeli Zionist interests are different from U.S. interests. I mean, they have different motivations. I can't think of significant ways in which they conflict at the moment, although someone else might point one out that I haven't thought of. I'm sorry. Who are you controlling the questions, or am I?
Yes. Well, you can pick people if you like. Do you want me to do it?
Okay, I'll be unfair.
Okay. I think he'll move the mic. Before we.
I think there may be a potential of conflict, and that is Donald Trump's policies in Syria and Iran in some kind of way have disrupted the policies of Netanyahu, who hitched his whole political career with Trump, and I think there is some disruption there. I don't know if it's obviously unintended, because Trump is rather volatile. So I just wonder, I mean, in technology they talk about disruption, how it completely can radically alter something. I wonder if you could comment on Trump's impact on the Israeli-US relationship, And the other thing that I wonder about is climate change, because climate change threatens the whole dependence on oil. And you were saying that Israel as an outpost, part of the reason for Israel being useful as an outpost is it helps to manage resources in the Middle East, oil being a major component of that.
Well, I mean, you're making the point that Trump is disruptive, and that's certainly the case. I can't really comment on Trump because it's too perplexing to me. In some respects, you could say the guy's just has his own agenda, and that the U.S. security establishment is vehemently opposed. But at other times, it doesn't seem to be the case. It's hard to say at times. I can't really make out what's going on myself. And then the issue about the climate change in oil. I wouldn't, the argument I make is that, well, the United States regards the Middle East as one State Department official once put it, as a stupendous source of wealth and strategic advantage. I don't think, well, my view is that US foreign policy is driven more by interest in oil. It's driven by interest in profit-making opportunities, whether they're related to oil or beyond oil. And also, sometimes you might scratch your head and say, what does oil have to do with Syria? Or other parts of the Middle East that aren't rich in oil. But, I mean, there are all kinds of strategic considerations related to oil and to the exploitation of economic opportunities. There's shipping routes, there's pipeline routes, etc.
So the direction is suicide. It's a suicidal direction, you're saying.
On climate change?
Well, of course it is. So it depends on the oil is always going to be the impetus. It's not going to end. That's what you're saying.
Well, I want to be pessimistic, yes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to remind people we have a refreshments table over here, so if you want to get some cookies, water, coffee, tea, it is available.
Okay. I just wanted to say I'll answer a question that hasn't been asked. It just struck me that I'll come around you. It just struck me. One of the things I should have mentioned, I talked about Mearsheimer and Walt, who've written the book on the U.S. lobby, and I said that they were liberals, and that probably accounted for their point of view. I should have elaborated a bit on that. The Mearsheimer and Walt approach is to look at U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and say, this doesn't make any sense. How do you explain this? It makes no sense at all. It's not good for the U.S. And when I say they're liberals, they can do that because they assume that the U.S. state is some kind of neutral organization that's looking after the benefit of all Americans, and say, from the perspective of all Americans, our policy doesn't make any sense. So, how do we explain that it doesn't make any sense? Aha! Someone must have hijacked it and forced us to do what we don't want to do or is against our interests. But the problem with that view is he doesn't recognize that the US state isn't a neutral instrument that's trying to represent the interests of Americans as a whole. It's a state that is dominated by a certain sector of US society, corporate America. So it represents their interests. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, do I have the speaking stick? Okay, as we all know, the situation in Syria has completely been reversed by the Syrian Arab Army, by their valiant and heroic resistance, by the Russians, massive aid in basically every way, shape, and form, and also recently Saudi Arabia took massive hits to both their military and also the world's largest oil refinery was basically blown up. what do you think is going to happen, especially now that we know, well, the latest news is that there are large numbers of Russian troops moving in to keep the peace in Syria and make sure that Turkey doesn't do anything stupid, and no doubt Israel doesn't do anything stupid either. So what do you think is going to happen now, essentially with that whole situation being turned on its head?
And Turkey's terrified of Russia, by the way. There was that.
And it appears as if the US forces are going to continue to control the oil resources with the intention of ensuring that the Syrian government doesn't get its hands on them or get its hands on its own resources. You also mentioned Israel. Something that often isn't mentioned about Israel or recognized is the degree to which Israel has played a role in that conflict. It's largely minimized or not acknowledged. And in fact, just recently, there was an Israeli general, I believe it was, who acknowledged that the Israelis have conducted thousands of airstrikes against, I like to say it's against Iranian targets, but they're against Iranian targets, against Hezbollah, against the Syrian Arab army. And they said most of them we've not acknowledged. And on top of doing that, of course, they've supported Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda groups. As Robert Fisk says, they bombed the Syrian Arab army, they bombed Hezbollah, they bombed the RGC, but they've never bombed ISIS, and they've never bombed Al-Qaeda. Next one.
Hello, I want to thank you for your talk. I'll start by saying that I consider myself an ardent critic of Israel. I think one needs only look into the 1982 incursion of Lebanon and the allotting of Lebanese extremists to slaughter Palestinians within Lebanon as a clear example of Israel's misbehavior in the Middle East. With that said, I have a few points of contention. The first would be that, to my knowledge, Israel was founded after the Second World War. However, it was not announced as a Zionist state that early. This would go further back to the late 19th century. Within the period of time between the First World War and the Second World War, mandatory Palestine was created. And the first emigres from Europe into Palestine were Eastern European Jews. And these would have been Eastern European Jews who were now undergoing the transformation of the Bolshevik Revolution in places like Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, etc. So to me, it's curious to see Israel as only a colonial power when there is at least a conjunction between its citizens being comprised of Soviet Jews, in a sense. The second contention would be that after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, there was a process in which potentially millions of Russians emigrated from Russia into Israel. And in that turn, they started to comprise Israel's scientific and engineering sectors of their society. That to me would challenge a modern view of Israel as simply a United States client state. And then the third point that I'd have to make is that the revelations of Jonathan Pollard in the late 1980s show that Israel infiltrated and has infiltrated United States intelligence. And not simply for the sake of taking documents and intelligence pertinent to Israel, but such documents that were pertinent to the Soviet Union. this suggests even a collusion between Mossad officers and Russia, KGB. So I'm curious to see that, in my view, under that evidence, it would not show that Israel is simply a frontier for the US, but rather that Israel has subverted large portions of the United States throughout its history. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, one of the problems in talking about Israel acting as an apparatus or an instrument of the United States, or any country acting as a satellite or an instrument of any other country, is that you simplify a little bit. And you simplify by, well, we should back up. I should back up. Israel has its own interests that are, in some respects, independent from those of the United States, and the United States has interests that are independent of those of Israel. If the United States didn't need Israel anymore, it would cut it loose in a moment, the way it cut loose the Kurds in a moment. Likewise, if the Israelis found that the Americans weren't supporting their project entirely, or if they could survive without American support, they would likely go their own way. But they have independent interests, and it doesn't mean that just because the United States is able to dominate Israel, and it does dominate Israel, because it does dominate Israel, because Israel is so dependent upon the United States, Israel must behave in a certain manner to ensure that it continues to receive the support it needs to survive. That doesn't mean that it doesn't oppose the United States in various ways. That doesn't mean that it might not spy on the United States, just as the Americans spy on the Israelis.
The Americans spy on everybody.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody spies on everybody. Where the world we live in.
Oh, here, but I guess I could.
Yeah, it seems to me that political Zionism has become much more of an influential force in the last 20 years, in particular under Netanyahu. But I'm wondering, if political Zionism existed back at the time of Herzl. And it seems to me that it's become more of a force under Netanyahu than it was, say, under Herzl.
Right, I would say it's right-wing Zionism has become more of a force under Netanyahu. And this comes from this kind of revisionist Zionism, which was different from the labor Zionism, which was typical of the early part of Israel. And the revisionist Zionism, I admire in one respect. Don't think I admire Zionism. I don't admire Zionism. But the revisionist Zionism seems to me to be far more realistic than labor Zionism. The labor Zionism was, we're here and we're going to get along with the Arabs, and the Arabs love us and they want us here, and they're welcoming us. And the right wing, or the revisionist Zionists, said, are you crazy? They don't want us here. We're stealing their land. That's when they talked about, the iron wall of bayonets. The only way we're going to deal with the Palestinians is with the iron wall of bayonets. We're going to have to crush them until they lose hope. And that's the only way they're going to accept us. We can't think that we're going to live peacefully with them, because how can we supplant them? How can we take their land and think they're going to love us? So I think, political Zionism has been around since Herzl. It informed all of the Zionist projects, but it's the right-wing Zionism that has become dominant since really the 70s. And perhaps it became dominant because it became evident that this labor Zionism was just completely unrealistic.
Callie?
Oh, sure.
I have a question that's not related entirely to what you said, but about the power of Israel elsewhere. And this summer I was spending some time with somebody on a recreational activity, and this person was a pharmacist. And I said, so what do the pharmacists make of? Did you spend any time in Toronto? No. Anyway, there was a double murder, and it's been written up in the paper last week, and there was a mysterious murder of a CEO who was head of a generic company, and apparently there were 2 generic companies, and one had been bought by Israel. And he said, there's no question, we all know it was the Mossad. No. So, what do you think of that? No, it has not been solved. Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't followed that one. Well, I know the murder, but I really only followed it superficially. I can't say.
So that's what the pharmaceutical commission.
It was probably the Russians, the Chinese, or the North Koreans.
Another.
Favorite country for Americans.
I don't think I need to like that. Stephen, I want to thank you for coming out. It's been really informative. My question is, what role do you see labor in North America having in being complicit with the situation? And when I say labor, I'm referring to the leadership more than the grassroots. Have you done any study on that issue?
Yes.
That was
Very fair point.
was labor and
What role
Labor had a complicity with Israel and what it's doing, and specifically like the labor leadership. Yes, that's true. I guess you could expand that to laborism and social democracy.
Well, I can't talk about the specifics, but I noticed labor, social democratic parties, other political parties. Who was it? It was, oh, you were talking about markets. I mean, I think the way they look at the world is there's an upside and there's a downside. Is there an upside to me supporting Palestinians? From their view, no. There's only a downside. So they avoid it. That's the way they approach it. But I do have a Mossad story. I was thinking of this while you were asking. Now, I can't vouch for the veracity of this, so living in Ottawa, here we're going back. Living in Ottawa,
Back in the good old days.
I get to, most of the people I know are either in the government or connected to the government. So I worked with a woman whose husband was with CSIS. And so I know that she had a very difficult life because it's really difficult to, and I've known a few people whose spouse worked with CSIS. It's difficult to work with those, or to live with those people. But it happened that I was reading the Globe and Mail, this was many years ago, and I read a story about, this was a claim, and this might be a bogus claim, but anyway, it was in the Globe and Mail, that there were guys going door to door and they were selling pictures. And it turned out that it was claimed that they were Mossad, or Israeli intelligence, and they had bugs in the pictures. And anyway, I mentioned this to her, and she said, "What? Some guys came to my door yesterday, and they were selling pictures." So, I don't know whether they were actually Israeli intelligence or not. But anyway, that was my Mossad story. Oh, Jerry.
Another question. Which committee else?
Yeah, I just wondered if you could comment a bit about some leftists, and in particular Robert Fisk, who you did mention, who have this sort of schizoid understanding of the Middle East, where they are quite critical of the state of Israel, say they're pro-Palestinian, and yet seem to be, at the same time, quite critical of many of the leaders of secular nationalist governments. I mean, I just read an article by Fisk yesterday where he described Assad as this cruel dictator, Iran as this barbaric, Gaddafi, etc. And at the same time, talking about, at length, about Israel's horrible treatment of the Palestinians.
And then it came to me
Yeah, well, I read Robert Fisk, and sometimes I like him, sometimes he becomes infuriating. And I think, I don't know if he identifies as an anarchist, but I think that's his point of view. He's against all governments. He doesn't like any government. And it's a pretty simple, safe position to take, especially if you're a journalist. I mean, criticize whatever government you want, then you appear to be neutral and fair-minded, and in his case, liberal and left-wing. But you're right, he is, that's a good description, schizoid.
There's a second question.
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah, nobody else.
Yeah, I'd like your view on the BDS movement. Israel claims that if you're a supporter of BDS, then you're anti-Semitic. And I just wonder what your view is.
My view is some people who support BDS are anti-Semitic, and some people, perhaps most people, perhaps the vast majority are not. There's no necessary connection between supporting BDS and being an anti-Semite. But that said, I mean, it should acknowledge that it's not the case that there aren't some anti-Semites, and it's not the case that there aren't some anti-Semites hiding behind anti-Zionism as well. But there's no necessary connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but the whole thing around Jeffrey Epstein, there was some talk that he had some connection with Israeli intelligence, and there's also business relationships with Ehud Barak. And have you explored that at all, or do you have any more insight? You probably don't. Oh, okay.
Nope.
I think it's really important to really sell the point that, as you pointed out, if it hadn't been the United States that engaged Israel's services, it would have been somebody else. They weren't choosy about who they served, as long as it was a white colonialist power. And I think it's important to remember that it could have been the British Empire, it could have been Canada, it could have been the Tsars that were still around, The point is that this is a mercenary nation that sells out its services to the highest bidder, and if the United States wasn't currently the highest bidder, it would be somebody else. And that also, that Zionism, the militant variety, has been around since almost the very start, like before Israel even existed, like when the earlier, basically since the second and third wave settlers started showing up in Palestine from the land they bought from the absentee owners over there. The first wavers wanted to just sell land, but everybody after that got more and more militant and started fighting with the Bedouins, and it got just worse over time. And this is before World War II even happened. I think it's important to remember that this is nothing new.
No, I mean, you're making a statement there, and I agree. I agree entirely.
Well, two more questions. That's
okay.
It. Just two more questions. Doug and
Not a question, just a big thank you. The Passing the Hat netted $203, so thank you very, very much for your contribution.
Thanks very, very much for your talk. I look forward to reading the book. But I need to dispute the view that labor and, well, the revisionists are as different as you suggest. And I know it's consistent with the view that since 1977, when Likud was first elected, that things have become more right-wing. But Labor, and I guess the major union was Histadrut, I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but their policy was to employ Jews only. And to me that is a profoundly racist outlook, consistent with Jabotinsky, and it reminds me of what I think is the difference between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, where the Conservatives are just more explicit about what they believe, and the Liberals, it may not be the same sort of veneer, but I think that. And the other, just a very brief comment, is that I noticed that Netanyahu in the last election in September, he was campaigning in Russian as well as Hebrew. I just caught it on the last day or two. And that I understood that a lot of Russians did leave the Soviet Union after the collapse in '89, but that a lot left too. But there, I had never noticed before that he campaigned in Russian as well as Hebrew. Just wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, I probably wasn't careful in my comments about revisionist Zionism. But you're right. I mean, some have pointed out, the labor Zionists, of course, had this kind of Marxist rhetoric and presented themselves as socialists. But it's been pointed out by others that their point of view was entirely non-socialist or contrary to socialism. It was a racist view, ultimately.
Like the National Socialist Party.
And it's also the case that Ben-Gurion, privately recognized this point of view that, the Jews were going to establish this solidarity with the Arabs and live together in peace was completely unrealistic. But I agree with your comments entirely. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We're closing up the question period here, but before we go, there are some announcements of some highly relevant things that are coming up. We just spent